that space is a warfighting domain, just like the land, air, and sea. We may even have a space force. We'll develop another one. Space Force. We have the Air Force, we'll have the Space Force. We have the Army, the Navy. When it comes to defending America, it is not enough to merely have an American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space. So important. Very importantly, I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the sixth branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement.
Listening to President Trump's mandate for a new military Space Force division stirs a flash of renewed national pride reminiscent of John F. Kennedy's call for a manned mission to the moon. But that brief glow of sentimental nationalism is tempered by the tragic reality of the need to weaponize space in the first place, which dredges up the old specter of Cold War rivalries that, following World War II, haunted global politics for 3 decades. Yet, if the United States does not assume military dominance in space, an enemy nation will likely do so instead. Such has always been the chronic competitive nature of human behavior throughout history. But weaponization of space spotlights a deeper, broader tragedy, the fundamentally violent and sociopathic nature of the human species itself. Here at the cusp of the 21st century, humans are still warring over Bronze Age rivalries that should have gone the way of the dinosaurs and dodo birds centuries ago. But no, thanks to vast industrial technologies, humans can play out their wildest homicidal fantasies today on a scale unimagined in the entire history of the species. Following the trail of man's ingenious determination to conquer the air, we see by the end of the 18th century he discovered taking to the sky with huge hot air balloons. In October 1783, French inventors, the Montgolfier brothers, demonstrated the first manned flight in their huge, colorful balloon. While such a feat seemed at first a charming novelty, it was not long before Army planners exploited the military potential of lighter-than-air flying devices. And 60 years later, hydrogen-filled balloons were employed for surveillance service during the American Civil War. But by 1886, visionary author Jules Verne foresaw controlled flying machines employed as engines of war, and 3 decades later, just such mechanical inventions were actually developed, raining death and destruction upon London, England, just as Verne had predicted. Inventor Ferdinand von Zeppelin himself declared that, loaded with 5 tons of bombs, his airships would become flying battleships that could strike at the heart of the enemy. Industrialization of the world's great nations spawned astounding advances in manned aircraft technologies, yet humans, never content to simply cruise the skies peaceably, quickly fashioned their flying machines into ever more efficient engines of destruction. And by the Second World War, Japan's daring attack on the United States Navy fleet at Pearl Harbor demonstrated just how military Air Force superiority had become an imperative. Over the course of that war, the United States gained global supremacy of air power, which was steadfastly maintained and expanded over the following 3 decades as the Strategic Air Command, a 3-fold defense force established to include land-based bomber squadrons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarine-based ballistic missiles, all keeping full-time defense posture against potential Soviet aggression. But politics, not warfare, caused Strategic Air Command's demise. In the late 1980s, Russian Premier Gorbachev initiated sweeping changes in the Soviet Union that led to the end of the Cold War. Strategic Air Command's strength was reduced in proportion to the diminished Soviet threat. In 1989, the Berlin Wall was dismantled, and on June 1, 1992, Strategic Air Command was disbanded. In 1991, following the Iraq military operation called Desert Storm, President George Herbert Walker Bush and Defense Secretary Dick Cheney directed Strategic Air Command to take all bomber, refueling aircraft, and Minuteman II ICBMs off continuous nuclear alert, placing those aircraft on quick reaction ground alert instead. But today's forces, even reduced by 50%, still hold a tremendous global air power defense advantage. Of course, concurrent with the drive to gain military supremacy in the air was the unavoidable consequence of seeking military supremacy in space. On September 8, 1944, the German Reich began the weaponization of space when it launched the first V-2 rocket attack on England. And although Hitler's wonder weapon failed to secure German victory, it introduced a revolutionary new weapons technology that would ultimately dominate the future of warfare. But guided missiles were not originally intended as weapons of mass destruction. As early as 1928, German filmmaker Fritz Lang produced an imaginative motion picture that seriously speculated about the possibility of manned space exploration, called Woman in the Moon. Until that time, rocket technology was generally theoretical speculation, until it gained serious financing by military weapons manufacturers, and thanks to the Second World War, rockets eventually gained full respectability, making the fanciful notions of manned space exploration a tangible reality. And after the war, rocket design technology grew increasingly sophisticated, with an eye on actually launching men into space. And by 1958, President Dwight Eisenhower established America's first civilian space agency, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, for the stated purpose of peaceful space exploration, which in turn launched captured German V-2 rocket designer Wernher von Braun into television celebrity status as he predicted manned space flights on Walt Disney's Man and the Moon video production. And over the next decade, thanks to von Braun's technical expertise, we would see Disney's fanciful spaceflight animations become spectacular reality. In all fairness to Wernher von Braun, his noble ambitions were never to build rocket weapons for Hitler or the United States, but to build manned rockets for space exploration. His ultimate dream was a manned mission to Mars. But World War II's enduring legacy, the combination of atomic bombs and space rockets, still menaced all of civilization. Growing fear of Soviet missile superiority and the threat of nuclear attack sparked an obsession with rocket design competition that dominated world attention for all of the 1960s. Determined that the United States would win this superpower race, President John F. Kennedy announced in May of 1961 the riveting mandate that within the decade, the United States would launch men to the moon.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And 7 years later, on July 16, 1969, von Braun's grandest baby, the 30-story tall Saturn V rocket, blasted into space. And 4 days later, Americans witnessed the culmination of Kennedy's lunar landing mandate as they watched astronaut Neil Armstrong step onto the moon. But while massive media attention was lavished on manned NASA launches throughout the 1960s, behind the scenes military planners were intent upon total domination of space. Even Farouk El-Baz, NASA's technical director for the Apollo space program, candidly admitted there was a very important philosophy. The Apollo program was not really designed to get men to the moon or to get samples of the moon rocks at all. The United States of America was absolutely terrified about the fact that the Russians would have these enormous, powerful rockets. But just 13 days before Apollo 11's launch, the Soviet Union's grand moon rocket ambitions dissolved in a catastrophic ball of fire on the Baikonur launch pad, the most devastating rocket failure in history. The Soviet N-1 rocket booster, meant to carry Russian cosmonauts to the moon, was the most powerful single-stage rocket ever made, including the American Saturn V Apollo booster. America's superior rocket technology prevailed. The space race was won, but with no further justification for massive space launch expenditures, the Apollo moon program was abandoned by 1972, and Wernher von Braun was abandoned as well. Relieved of his supervisory position with Apollo, von Braun was shunted into a meaningless bureaucratic job in Washington, D.C. 5 years later, the unrivaled titan of American rocket engineering was dead of cancer. But with the conclusion of the Apollo missions, the whole character of NASA changed. Saturn rocket launches were abandoned, subsequent space shuttle launches were labeled classified. More and more the public was locked out of whatever NASA was doing in space. Even today, privatization of space industries has rendered space exploration a very exclusive club for eccentric billionaires like Elon Musk and Robert Bigelow. So, in the face of such a dramatic reversal of our nation's military and spacefaring fortunes, it seems wildly inappropriate for President Trump to endorse creation of a sixth-branch Space Force division of the military without some kind of legitimate, compelling justification. At the outset of America's space missions, Wernher von Braun knew he was facing a formidable competitor, Sergei Korolev, Russia's chief rocket design engineer, who was equally determined to see Soviet dominance in space. Over the entire decade of the 1960s, NASA's space program created a dynamic focus of collective national pride. Full mass media coverage of manned rocket launches engaged all the American people as collective, enthusiastic participants in man's first exploration of space. Each year of that decade saw ever more daring space launches, with manned orbital flights and spacewalks, all culminating with the climactic spectacle of Apollo's moon landing theatrics. Justification for a superior American space program was never questioned, thanks to fierce competition from the Russians. But half a century later, what is today's justification for a renewed Space Force initiative? Does some unstated off-planet threat loom over us like hostile space aliens? The problem may lie closer to home.
Human beings have come to new territory and contested it. Conflict has followed.
Human beings forever have wanted to explore what's beyond the hill, the horizon. And as we go out there, there's always been conflict. Conflict in the Wild West as we moved into the West. Conflict twice in Europe with horrible world wars. So every time humans actually physically move into that, there's conflict. And in that case, we'll have to be prepared for that.
NASA's inception in 1958 was a direct response to the potential challenge of a single Soviet military presence in space only. Today we face the challenge of a proliferation of a multinational military presence in space. Russia, China, Japan, India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Iran, not to mention North Korea, all have their own discrete space exploration ambitions. In other words, we are looking at the unavoidable multicultural potential for our conflict in space. So unlike the good old Cold War days when it was only Russia we had to worry about, the potential for political competition conflicts in space is growing exponentially. Any rocket fitted to launch harmless satellites can just as easily be fitted to launch atomic warheads. Vital multinational communications and surveillance satellite systems are potentially fragile, vulnerable assets easily targeted should terrestrial political squabbles turn hostile. So with this in mind, President Trump's surprise call for a new Space Force is more than justified. It may be well overdue. We just might need a trusty traffic cop Space Force to save us from an international space race free-for-all. Considering such a dangerous situation, perhaps a bona fide extraterrestrial threat just might be the only thing keeping multinational space operations distracted from warring with each other.
I'm convinced that the Russian concept is very clear. They consider the control of space around the Earth very much like, shall we say, the great maritime powers considered the control of the seas in the 16th to the 18th century. And they say if we want to control this planet, we have to control the space around it.
On January 7, 1958, the very same year NASA was formed, Senator Lyndon Johnson made this revealing statement concerning the future status of our national defense and the race for space. Control of space means control of the world. From space, the masters of infinity would have the power to control the Earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change temperate climates to frigid. There is something more important than the ultimate weapon, and that's the ultimate position. The position of total control over the Earth that lies somewhere in outer space. Clearly, military control of space has been a priority for a very long time. And since 1960, while American taxpayers were bamboozled into believing they were financing a peaceful civilian space agency, they likely have been financing a covert military space agency the whole time, one that President Trump now seems intent to bring out of the closet. For decades now, a flurry of rumors from military insiders and conspiracy researchers claim a sophisticated secret space force is already in operation. In 2001, whistleblower Gary McKinnon, a British citizen and computer genius, claimed to have hacked into 53 United States government agency computer systems, including the United States Space Command Network, where he found evidence of a Space Force military mission. I found a list of officers' names under the heading Non-Terrestrial Officers. What I think it means is not Earth-based. I found a list of fleet-to-fleet transfers and a list of ship names. I looked them up. They weren't United States Navy ships. What I saw made me believe they have some kind of spaceship off-planet. So, much like World War II's top-secret Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb, it is certainly within reason to suspect national defense agencies have likely used the same covert approach to create a top-secret space force. And nesting such projects with private contractors conveniently protects it from freedom of information public scrutiny. Despite President Trump's enthusiastic call for the addition of a sixth branch military Space Force division, it seems he would have formidable congressional and public opposition to financing such an extravagant mandate, especially if it means starting from scratch. But on the other hand, what if a fully operational Space Force already exists? In 2001, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld claimed he could not account for a missing $2.3 trillion of defense budget money. Today, that amount has ballooned to $21 trillion. How much secret space fleet can you buy for $21 trillion? Former Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under the first Bush administration, Catherine Austin Fitts, tells us $21 trillion is missing from the United States government. That is $65,000 for every person in America. That is more than our entire national debt. She includes, "We have one budget financing 2 civilizations, and one of those civilizations is secret." Since World War II, the corporate black ops network directly involved with advanced technologies, whether back-engineered from alien science or not, has become so far removed from mainstream Americana that it has evolved into a separate, secret, high-tech empire unto itself. An elitist, hybrid civilization literally disintegrated from its parent civilization, leaving the rest of unenlightened humanity technologically and politically irrelevant. So more than the culture shock of extraterrestrials landing on the White House lawn, the economic shock of free energy quantum technology disclosure would likely precipitate a meltdown of globalist, petroleum-based geopolitical domination. According to Catherine Austin Fitts, President Trump has initiated a process to reverse the globalist agenda to dismantle United States sovereignty by returning to a strong national, Fortress America economic and industrial power base. And his call for a space force clearly defies the potentially dangerous emergence of multinational space agencies. Finally, it is worth noting that the United States Constitution mandates provision for the common defense. As such, contingency planning for defense against any and all threats to our national security, whether terrestrial or otherwise, is the job the United States military gets paid to do. And as more human activity enters into space, our military defense must also expand into space proportionately. Meanwhile, whether President Trump's call for a new Space Force will play out for good or ill on the world scene remains uncertain. But all the same, it is an extraordinary unfolding drama well worth sharp scrutiny.